Here we see coroner Dr. Brian Farrell, and his witness neuropathologist Professor Michael Farrell, who performed Mirek's autopsy. Bottom left is neurologist Dr. Tim Lynch, who misdiagnosed Mirek as having pseudoseizures, when in fact he was in status epilepticus with myoclonic manifestations, and on the top right is Justice John Hedigan, who in this judicial review judgment stated, "The coroner's verdict is based from the evidence primarily of Dr. Lynch and Professor Farrell." Professor Michael Farrell was not an independent pathologist and should not have been nominated to carry out the post-mortem. Justice John Hedigan stated in his judicial review judgment, "As to the complaint, Professor Michael Farrell was not a proper person to be nominated to carry out the post-mortem. This is based on the applicant's contention that he was a colleague of Dr. Lynch and assisted him in diagnosing Mirek's condition. Professor Farrell was chosen by the coroner because he was aware the applicants had problems with the staff of the mater. The coroner wisely and in deference to the applicant's sensitivities chose an independent outside pathologist. Professor Farrell was one of the most eminent practitioners in Ireland who was Professor of Neuropathology at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and a consultant in the Department of Neuropathology at Beaumont Hospital. All that is alleged by the applicants is that Professor Farrell received samples from Dr. Lynch in an effort to determine Mirek's condition prior to his death." Bernard Bingham, Mirek's dad, states the following. At 10:30 p.m. on December 31, 1999, approximately 1.5 hours after Mirek passed away, consultant neurologist Dr. Tim Lynch requested to speak to my family and I. Dr. Tim Lynch was advised by my brother that the family did not wish to speak with him. Dr. Tim Lynch totally ignored our family not wanting to speak with him, and entered into the room in which my wife, our 2 daughters and I were grieving. Dr. Tim Lynch expressed no remorse for his involvement in Mirek's death, but requested permission from us to donate Mirek's brain to him for research, which Dr. Tim Lynch explained may possibly be of benefit to our daughters and their children in the future. We were totally shocked and disgusted by this request from the consultant, who, when our son Mirek was alive and needed his help, placed Mirek under minimal intervention, refused to perform an EEG for 14 days after the commencement of seizures and therefore misdiagnosed status epilepticus with myoclonic manifestations as pseudoseizures for 14 days. And on October 21, 1999, at 4:30 p.m., when Mirek was in status epilepticus and respiratory failure, Dr. Tim Lynch failed to attend Mirek, despite the request of the surgical registrar, Dr. James O'Riordan. For those reasons, we felt that Dr. Tim Lynch was not worthy to receive Mirek's brain for his medical research. Approximately 2 hours after Mirek passed away, and while our family was still in the Mater Hospital, I received a telephone call from Dublin City Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell. Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell informed me that Professor Michael Farrell, consultant neuropathologist at Beaumont Hospital, was to carry out a post-mortem on our son Mirek's body. I made strong objections to Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell on December 31, 1999, the morning Mirek passed away, to Professor Michael Farrell carrying out the post-mortem, as the family considered Professor Michael Farrell not to be an independent pathologist, because of his involvement with Dr. Tim Lynch in attempting to diagnose Mirek's condition, whilst Mirek was still alive and an inpatient in the Mater Hospital. We felt that his evidence and credibility could be called into question at the inquest as a result. Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell then advised that he would attempt to instruct another pathologist. At approximately 5 p.m. that evening, after my family and I returned home to Dundalk, Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell telephoned me and informed me that no other pathologist was available to carry out the post-mortem. Again, I raised my concerns with regard to credibility and the conflict of interest if Professor Michael Farrell was instructed to perform the post-mortem, but coroner Dr. Brian Farrell advised that he was allowing the post-mortem to go ahead the next morning, with Professor Michael Farrell as pathologist. Given our concerns and objections and the fact that we were in shock and grieving Mirek's untimely death, coroner Dr. Brian Farrell failed to advise that we were within our rights to engage our own independent pathologist to supervise the post-mortem, especially given our concerns regarding coroner Dr. Brian Farrell's appointment of Professor Michael Farrell. Section 52, 2b, of the Coroners Act 1962 provides that S.52, 2a, shall not apply to a registered medical practitioner who is a pathologist on the staff of, or associated with, a hospital save where the coroner considers the conduct of such practitioner in relation to his attendance on the deceased person is likely to be called into question at the inquest. Justice John Hedigan in his judgment states, Professor Michael Farrell was chosen by the coroner because he was aware the applicants had problems with the staff of the mater. The coroner wisely and in deference to the applicant's sensitivities chose an independent outside pathologist. The Bingham family do not accept coroner Dr. Brian Farrell and Mr. Justice John Hedigan's position that pathologist Professor Michael Farrell was independent and was not associated with the mater hospital. Between August 1999 and December 31, 1999, while Mirek was a patient in the Mater Public Hospital, Dr. Tim Lynch engaged pathologist, Professor Michael Farrell to analyze Mirek's biopsy muscle tissue and blood samples, as the required genetic tests could not be performed at the Mater Hospital. Although Professor Michael Farrell was a pathologist at the Beaumont, he was carrying out contractual work for the Mater Hospital, on tissue samples of their patient Mirek Bingham. There can be no doubt that Professor Michael Farrell was involved in Mirek's case, and coroner Dr. Brian Farrell accepted the Bingham family's position on the issue, by attempting to instruct an alternative pathologist, who would be considered independent by the family. The Bingham family are of the opinion that coroner Dr. Brian Farrell and Mr. Justice John Hedigan took an unreasonably limited view of the definition of attendance from the Act, by interpreting it to be a person or persons who attended physically upon a patient. The Bingham family would dispute this, and argue it has a much broader definition to include anyone who plays a part relating to the science of medicine required to diagnose and treat a patient. The Coroners Act, 1962, is extremely out of date. The genetic testing, such as Professor Michael Farrell was carrying out, was not available at that time, and therefore not provided for in the Act. Professor Michael Farrell was in attendance on Mirek, because he was charged with analyzing Mirek's muscle tissue for the purposes of a clinical diagnosis. Therefore, Mirek was equally the patient of Professor Michael Farrell, as that of Dr. Tim Lynch, when clearly Dr. Tim Lynch required the assistance of Professor Michael Farrell in ruling in, or out, medical conditions that could be responsible for Mirek's symptoms. Coroner, are you in a position to, can you deal with some questions about this technical? Professor Farrell, I can, but I will do the best I can, as I have tried to do throughout the last 8 years of this particular case, but if it gets to a situation where I am now, I am in sort of, here as on trial if you like, then I will have to withdraw and get legal representation to protect myself. Coroner, I understand. Professor Farrell, and I would hope that you yourself would facilitate that, as I am your witness. Coroner, of course, I shall. Professor Farrell. Professor Farrell, yes. Coroner, I don't know what you wish to ask. I am at a disadvantage here. Dr. Mills, Well, coroner, in fact just a couple of small matters, and I can assure the witness that on the basis of my instructions there, no issue arises in respect of this witness save for the putting to him of certain matters relating to information that this family hoped to have last March but unfortunately didn't have. Coroner: well, very well. Dr. Mills: and only got sight of towards the end of last year. Coroner: Professor Farrell, if you have any difficulty in dealing with any of these items. Professor Farrell: yes. Coroner: you can let me know. Professor Farrell: yes, of course I can. Dr. Mills: and similarly I will try and keep my questions as open-ended as possible for you. There were two brief extracts, one is a single sheet and one is some sheets clipped together. You will see there is a sheet marked number 16 which is headed. Do you have that? Professor Farrell: yes, sure. Dr. Mills: which is marked long-range PCR analysis of mitochondrial DNA. Professor Farrell: yeah. Dr. Mills: and it is headed M. Bingham. It says wild-type mtDNA, which I think is mitochondrial DNA. Professor Farrell: yeah. Dr. Mills: I suppose it is the bracketed section there I want to start with. Banding pattern may indicate presence of mitochondrial interjection. Professor Farrell: just give that up to me. Dr. Mills: sorry, it should be headed page 16, I can give you my copy? Professor Farrell: oh, 16, sorry, just, okay, oh sorry, yeah, it is the other side, sorry, yet. Dr. Mills: banding pattern may indicate presence of mitochondrial deletions? Professor Farrell: yeah. Dr. Mills: or rearrangements? Professor Farrell: yeah. Dr. Mills: it's just the use of the word may there, Professor Farrell? Professor Farrell: sure. Dr. Mills: could you just speak to that word there? It may indicate the presence. What else might it indicate the presence of? Professor Farrell: I am not sure that it would indicate anything else, just hold on a second here. It is for negative control. Okay, sorry, yet. Okay, can I just take you through it here? Dr. Mills: okay. Professor Farrell: okay, these are normal controls that we run for a size. The next lane, number 2, is left, from your left? Dr. Mills: I suppose it would make most sense to show it to the coroner insofar as. Professor Farrell: okay. Coroner: would it be possible, if I were to put it on the screen? Professor Farrell: could you? Interjection. Professor Farrell: yeah, sure, yeah. PCR analysis. Using PCR, millions of copies of a section of DNA are made in just a few hours, yielding enough DNA required for analysis. This innovative yet simple method allows clinicians to diagnose and monitor diseases using a minimal amount of sample, such as blood or tissue. Professor Farrell: these are just pages from the laboratory book. They're of JPEG images, or whatever from the laboratory book, of the technologist who does all this work in the laboratory. So lane 1 you're reading from the left is, from a DNA lab report. DNA of different sizes. Lane 2 then is a negative control. There is no DNA in this specimen at all. Okay. Lane 3 then, is one of the patients that I've just described there, in my evidence over the last hour, JH, who's got multiple deletions present. Lane 4 and then 5 are of patients who do not have deletions. Now on lane 6 then is Mirek. But you can see as you come down a couple of bands present, okay. So there are some deletions there, but the difference between Mirek and the other patients is that Mirek still has huge amounts of normal mitochondrial DNA present, whereas this patient has virtually consumed all of his normal mitochondrial DNA. What we are getting here is a mixture of normal and abnormal. In this patient's case there was hardly any normal left. In Mirek's case there is an awful lot of normal left, almost as much as the other two. Professor Farrell also referred to the 2 other patients with deletions of mitochondrial DNA in his evidence to the inquest. Professor Farrell, I was looking at the other 2 patients I described earlier on, with a similar phenotype to Mirek. You know, seizures on a background of spinocerebellar degeneration. Which is attributable to mitochondrial in those 2, but not so clearly in Mirek's case. Both of these individuals, they had deletions of mitochondrial DNA. It would appear Professor Farrell has given contradictory evidence, as he has previously stated lane 4 and 5 are of patient who do not have deletions. Professor Michael Farrell is not a geneticist, therefore he should not have been allowed to give evidence on genetics. But there are bands fatal. The portrayal of the images is in fact it's a photocopy, it doesn't actually let you see those so well, but there are bands there. So there are deletions, it's the significance on in terms of the overall context. And to the layman it would appear that the difference between bands 2 and 5, seems to be quite marked. Professor Farrell, oh absolutely. Yet. Yes. No. 2 is negative, there is nothing in 2. Dr. Mills, oh I'm sorry. Band 3 and. Professor Farrell, correct. Yes. Dr. Mills, band 6. Professor Farrell, yes. That's right. Dr. Mills, there is quite a substantial difference between them. This is page 20 from the lab book of the technologist, Ms. Rachel Howley, Bachelors of Science, who is a neuroscience research scientist, in the Beaumont Hospital, who does all this work in the laboratory. Page 20 shows results of the first PCR test, from November 14, 2006. The previous document in this video is the only document submitted, accepted in evidence, and displayed on the screen as evidence of a PCR test during the inquest. However, the document was an edited, fabricated, version of the original document from page 20 of the lab book. As can be seen, the edited document was not dated, neither was it signed by a clinical molecular geneticist, which would be standard protocol in an accredited laboratory. In fact, none of the documents in the book are signed by a clinical molecular geneticist. Ms. Howley in a Freedom of Information request stated, conclusion in relation to samples tested November 14, 2006 were not done. Dr. Mills, it is just page 24, if you look at the middle of page 24 it just sets out Mirek Bingham. Professor Farrell, yet. Dr. Mills, and his 2 sample results there. Professor Farrell, sure. Dr. Mills, I think you referred earlier to 2 or 3 samples being done. Professor Farrell, that's right. The problem again is one of quantization. Sometimes I mean these can be very faint and I can't see them at all, in which case you'd have to report it as a negative, and on one of these samples it was negative. And in one of his samples it was negative and in two it was positive. And again, it's to do with thresholds. It's to do with the amount that is present, to do with the sensitivity of the ascites. All of that comes into play. So again as I said earlier on, I'm not trying to hang the whole case on that, by no means. I think, it gets back to the phenotypical spectrum of disease. I mean, if I had a mutation I'd be able to say that's it for definite, so I can't say that. All I can do is offer to the court that this is in my view the possible likely explanation. November 6, 2007. Dear Mr. Sheehan, I am now in receipt of your emailed information received yesterday and have had an opportunity to read through what has been sent. Unfortunately, this is insufficient upon which to ground a firm opinion. The pathology sent will not allow me to ascertain whether evidence of a mitochondrial abnormality is present, and the quality of the photographic reproductions of the laboratory gels is poor, not enabling me to assess these either. Without being critical, I would draw attention to the handwritten statement on the photographs indicating that, although not apparent on the images, bands indicating multiple deletions were present. This must be open to visual interpretation and would require the original images to be viewed to confirm this. In the time available, I doubt that this situation can be adequately resolved by me for your clients and the court, for which I apologize. You have stated that Dr. Farrell's opinion related to a mitochondrial disorder. It is clearly stated in his report that there are no features present in the body to suggest an underlying mitochondrial defect. This is further supported by the results of the French report on the respiratory chain analysis which you have sent me. This shows no abnormality in all the relevant complexes examined, which makes a mitochondrial derangement rather unlikely. Mutations in POLG1 are responsible for Alpers disease, and this gene has been quite extensively sequenced in Mirek with no mutations found. The multiple deletions annotated in muscle would have supported a diagnosis of Alpers disease, but as stated above, are open to interpretation, and this is not possible on the images sent. However, I draw your attention to page 24 as numbered, where it appears to state in handwritten notation that re-extraction of DNA from muscle on February 13, 2007 and analysis demonstrated no deletions. I do not know whether there has been any change of method used etc., but this seems to contradict the earlier report. This certainly leaves open the question as to whether the original findings were correct. The photocopy of the gels, in Professor Michael Farrell's pathology lab files, appear to be from Ms. Howley's computer hard drive. It would appear Ms. Howley is the person Professor Michael Farrell refers to as the technician who carried out the PCR analysis in the pathology lab attached to Beaumont Hospital. Ms. Howley is not a geneticist. Professor Michael Farrell is not a geneticist. In 2006 and 2007 the pathology lab attached to Beaumont Hospital was not accredited for the carrying out of PCR analysis. Ms. Carmel MacDonald, Freedom of Information Officer, Beaumont Hospital, on August 31, 2007, supplied the following information to the Bingham family. Ms. Rachel Howley, BC Neuroscience Research Scientist, Beaumont Hospital. Ms. Howley says that a conclusion was not done in relation to samples tested on 14/11/06. Dr. Farrell's job title and qualifications. Dr. Farrell is appropriately qualified to practice as a consultant neuropathologist at Beaumont Hospital. Comment: a conclusion was not done in relation to samples tested on 14/11/06. But Professor Michael Farrell used an edited, fabricated, document, resembling the original gel samples tested on 14/11/06, on which a conclusion was not done. The original gel samples had the reference C3, referring to the third and final PCR test, on page 24 dated 2207, on which the conclusion states, N99 to 871, muscle. Same muscle had DNA extracted on 13207. All WT, wild type, mitochondrial DNA, no deletions. Therefore, the question arises, why did Professor Michael Farrell display a document with a photocopy of a gel which was not dated, had no indication of who performed the test, or where the test was carried out? A question also arises as to why coroner Dr. Brian Farrell allowed such a document to be relied upon as sufficient evidence of a mitochondrial disorder, enabling him to attribute a mitochondrial disorder as a contributing factor to death on Mirek Bingham's death certificate. The photocopy of the gel itself does resemble the gel from the test carried out on November 14, 2006, on which a conclusion was not done. In other words, results were not conclusive enough to be relied upon as evidence of deletions. So, therefore, the original gel was not convincing enough to be displayed as evidence of mitochondrial deletions at Mirek Bingham's inquest. Professor Michael Farrell, in his amended autopsy report, not dated, submitted to the inquest on December 20, 2006 and again on November 12, 2007, states, "There was widespread death of nerve cells throughout the brain, which I attributed to an energy deprivation state within nerve cells and brought about by a combination of a severe seizure disorder superimposed on the background of a generalized neurologic disorder most likely of mitochondrial origin." Professor Michael Farrell, in his original autopsy report, January 1, 2000, documents the final neuropathologic diagnosis, including neuropathology histology, as follows. Muscle. Occasional cytochrome oxidase negative fibers are present in the quadriceps and biceps but not in the intercostal muscle. However, the significance of these remains undetermined, particularly as this is post-mortem muscle with suboptimal preservation. The changes in the brain were of several weeks' duration. These changes, in my view, reflect an hypoxic-ischemic insult to the brain at some stage in the previous weeks. It is considered more likely that the seizures arose as a result of an hypoxic-ischemic insult to the brain. Professor Michael Farrell did not retain any autopsy muscle, as confirmed in his letter dated June 11, 2001 to Dr. Pierre Rustin in Paris. Professor Michael Farrell, 7 years after his original autopsy report, is now claiming in his amended autopsy report, "There was widespread death of nerve cells throughout the brain which I attributed to an energy deprivation state within nerve cells." Professor Michael Farrell transcript. So what we had evidence here, that there was a deficiency in the enzyme or one of the enzymes in that respiratory chain that is required to make ADP. So this is like, this event was acquired during life between the time his first muscle biopsy was sent to us and the muscle biopsy we examined at post-mortem. We've got COX depletion of, cytochrome oxidase depletion in muscle that arose during the course of these 3 to 4 months in hospital. Now this was an acquired event, this is very important. During life we had received a muscle biopsy on Mirek from the Mater Hospital and there was no evidence of cytochrome oxidase deficiency at that time. I think there is evidence here of an evolving fundamental process that is culminating in massive nerve cell death, seizures, changes in muscle and so on. It's evolving over time, relatively acutely over periods of 3 to 4 months. So now you are into a vicious cycle of an inherent weakness, a trigger, seizures generated, focal and then quickly becoming generalized, then the patient on a ventilator in status epilepticus and then nerve injury. The task that was facing me at the end of all of that was to try and decipher the relevant contribution of each of those, and that is extremely difficult. In Mirek's case, the evidence is not overwhelming. We've got COX depletion of cytochrome oxidase depletion in muscle that arose during the course of these 3 to 4 months in hospital. We have some evidence that there was breakages in his mitochondrial DNA that probably arose as well over time. We have evidence of spinocerebellar degeneration, that there was previous neurologic disease, and all I wanted to do was suggest one possible global or overriding explanation for all of the things that took place, rather than trying to effect out one individual event. Professor Michael Farrell also stated in his evidence, "Then there is an inherent weakness." Now obviously all of this would have had to have been done on brain, and respiratory chain studies done on brain. It is done on the surrogate, which is the muscle, which is not the same as brain. So you can have normal, respiratory chain studies. From Professor Michael Farrell's original autopsy report, which he did not read into the inquest evidence. The significance of the occasional cytochrome oxidase negative fibers remained undetermined. This was post-mortem muscle from which pathologist Professor Michael Farrell did not retain samples for future analysis, as confirmed in his letter dated June 11, 2001, to Dr. Pierre Rustin in Paris, France. However, Professor Michael Farrell, 7 years after his original post-mortem report, is now attributing the widespread death of nerve cells throughout the brain to an energy deprivation state within nerve cells. Professor Michael Farrell had no post-mortem muscle available for further analysis, so how can Professor Michael Farrell, 7 years after his original autopsy report, give evidence that the death of nerve cells throughout the brain was attributed to inherent weakness, an energy deprivation state within nerve cells, when it was impossible for him to have carried out further tests on autopsy muscle, when he did not retain autopsy muscle samples for further analysis? Professor Michael Farrell has also stated, now obviously all of this would have had to have been done on brain, and respiratory chain studies done on brain. But Professor Michael Farrell's original autopsy report states, representative sections from brain were taken and the calvarium was removed. Yet respiratory chain studies were not done on brain. In here, Professor Michael Farrell's evidence in respect of an inherent weakness is entirely contradictory, and should not have been accepted by coroner Dr. Brian Farrell. Professor Michael Farrell claims that it was the inherent weakness that essentially caused Mirek's seizures to develop into status epilepticus, which was resistant to treatment. Yet, in his evidence, Professor Michael Farrell also states, in Mirek's case, the evidence is not overwhelming. This video has already demonstrated that there was no evidence of an inherent weakness. Professor Michael Farrell's evidence to the inquest was that, in Mirek's case, the evidence is not overwhelming. And this is confirmed by the following. In the original post-mortem report, which was not read into the record at the inquest, Professor Michael Farrell documents: muscle. Occasional cytochrome oxidase negative fibers are present in the quadriceps and biceps but not in the intercostal muscle. However, the significance of these remains undetermined, particularly as this is post-mortem muscle with suboptimal preservation. Professor Michael Farrell also documented in the original post-mortem report. These changes, in my view, reflect an hypoxic-ischemic insult to the brain at some stage in the previous weeks. It is considered more likely that the seizures arose as a result of a hypoxic-ischemic insult to the brain. Professor Michael Farrell, we have evidence of spinocerebellar degeneration, that there was previous neurologic disease. Autopsy report, elsewhere there was evidence of a spinocerebellar degeneration. The appearances are considered to represent a relatively pure spinocerebellar degeneration with partial motor involvement. The cause of this is unknown. No evidence for a deficiency in the cytochrome oxidase, respiratory chain, from either the Paris tests, or from Professor Michael Farrell's Beaumont laboratory tests, which were carried out on live muscle, taken on the day of Mirek's surgery, October 4, 1999. Professor Michael Farrell stated, "Now obviously all of this would have to have been done on brain and respiratory chain studies done on brain. So, Professor Michael Farrell now considers the respiratory chain tests done on muscle were of no value, as they should have been done on brain, but Professor Farrell did take brain samples, so why did he not do the respiratory chain tests on brain?" However, Dr. Pierre Rustin from the Hospital de Malades Enfants, Paris, whose interest is in the understanding and curing of mitochondrial diseases, in particular those linked to respiratory chain deficiency, analyzed Mirek's live muscle and found no deletions in all of the respiratory chain complexes examined. No deletions in Mirek's mitochondrial DNA analyzed on February 14, 2007. Mirek didn't have mutations in polymerase gamma. The Bingham family's reason for requesting new inquest/reopening of Mirek's case. The Bingham family are adamant that Mirek did not have an inherent weakness, due to a neurological disorder consistent with a mitochondrial defect. Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell's death certificate ultimately attributes Mirek's death to natural causes. C. Progressive neurological disorder consistent with a mitochondrial defect. Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell's record of verdict states, "The underlying cause was widespread neuronal loss and gliosis due to an energy deprivation state within nerve cells brought about by a refractory seizure disorder, commencing as focal symptomatic seizures becoming generalized and of a status epilepticus nature, and/or hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy." Mirek Bingham suffered from a progressive neurological disorder characterized as spinocerebellar degenerative disorder consistent with a mitochondrial defect. The Bingham family state that coroner Dr. Brian Farrell failed to record his own findings on Mirek's death certificate. Failed to record status epilepticus. Failed to record hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. The Bingham family state that coroner Dr. Brian Farrell recorded findings that there was no evidence for EPC, epilepsy partialis continua. Progressive neurological disorder consistent with a mitochondrial defect. The specific name of the mitochondrial disorder was not recorded on Mirek's death certificate. The Bingham family object therefore to a finding that Mirek died due to epilepsy partialis continua caused by a progressive neurological disorder consistent with a mitochondrial defect, when coroner Dr. Brian Farrell did not have the evidence to support such a finding. In Professor Michael Farrell's own words, "I mean, definitive proof would have been a demonstration that there was a particular mutation in one of the 3 or 4 genes that makes mitochondrial DNA, but as I say, we have looked at the commonest one and we weren't able to see a mutation in that." The PCR test on the 13th, February 14, 2007 demonstrated no deletions to the mtDNA. The Bingham family state that Professor Michael Farrell colluded with coroner Dr. Brian Farrell by amending his post-mortem report to attribute a deficiency in the cytochrome oxidase 2, an energy deprivation state within nerve cells, and brought about by a combination of a severe seizure disorder superimposed on the background of a neurologic disorder most likely of mitochondrial origin. It is clear to the Bingham family that by concluding that Mirek's neurological disorder had a mitochondrial origin, it facilitated coroner Dr. Brian Farrell to disregard any evidence of deficiencies in Mirek's hospital course and care, and instead to attribute his death to natural causes. The Bingham family state that the following verbal evidence by Professor Michael Farrell suggests the changes to Mirek's mitochondria were acquired during the 3 to 4 months Mirek was in hospital. There was a deficiency in the enzyme or one of the enzymes in that respiratory chain that is required to make ADP. There is evidence here of an evolving fundamental process that is culminating in massive nerve cell death, seizures, changes in muscle and so on. It's evolving over time, relatively acutely over periods of 3 to 4 months. This event was acquired during life between the time of his first muscle biopsy was sent to us, October 4, 1999, and the muscle biopsy we examined at post-mortem, December 31, 1999. The Bingham family state that coroner Dr. Brian Farrell disregarded the verbal evidence of his own witness Professor Michael Farrell, whose own evidence was that the changes to Mirek's mitochondrial DNA occurred over the 3 to 4 months when Mirek was in hospital. This evidence excludes the possibility that Mirek was born with an inherent weakness, a cytochrome oxidase deficiency due to a mitochondrial defect. The Bingham family state that Professor Michael Farrell's verbal evidence was inconsistent, and his evidence failed to prove that Mirek's death was due to an inherent weakness, a cytochrome oxidase deficiency, due to a mitochondrial defect. The overwhelming lack of evidence presented in this video to support coroner Dr. Brian Farrell's finding that death was due to epilepsy partialis continua as a result of a progressive neurological disorder consistent with a mitochondrial defect, supports the Bingham family's reasoning that the inquest into the death of Mirek Bingham should be reopened. This video has been created to make it known to the Attorney General, our public representatives in the Dáil and the Senate, and the Irish public, as to the violations that occurred in respect of the Bingham family's right to have had a comprehensive investigation into Mirek Bingham's death by coroner Dr. Brian Farrell, where he ignored the consequences of the deficiencies of care, minimal intervention, the misdiagnosis of epileptic seizures causing a delay in medical treatment, resulting in respiratory arrest, and Mirek been placed on life support for 72 days, until he passed away on December 31, 1999. The Bingham family call upon our elected representatives in both houses, through individual written requests, to lobby the Attorney General, in order to have the inquest reopened with the view to examine all the evidence, including the coroner's own witness, Professor Michael Farrell's complete Beaumont Hospital laboratory file. Hear evidence from independent expert medical witnesses, specifically a geneticist, neurologist, and intensivist. Jury empaneled. To engage a coroner to act independently from the medical profession, other agencies of the state or any parties who may have an interest in the outcome of an investigation, inquest into Mirek's death. This video has proven that coroner Dr. Brian Farrell failed to adhere to the precedent set out by Mr. Justice Hardiman in his judgment, where coroner Brian Farrell was the applicant in Eastern Health Board-5B Farrell, 2001 IESC 96, 2001. It is common knowledge that in very many cases the proximate cause of death is itself secondary to some other condition or process, whether medical or external. To confine an inquiry into how the death occurred to the ascertainment of the immediate or proximate cause would often be utterly uninformative. Certainly, this exercise would in very many cases fail to meet any of the purposes of a coroner's inquest, identified above. It would not be acceptable, for instance, to state merely the death was caused by cardiac arrest without distinguishing whether the arrest in itself was induced by some process of disease, or by external trauma. Finally, Mirek was admitted to the Mater Hospital on September 15, 1999 for investigations of a swallowing disorder, which was diagnosed as achalasia and for which a Heller's myotomy surgery was to be carried out on October 4, 1999. Achalasia is a condition where the food tube, esophagus, loses the ability to squeeze food down, and the muscular valve between the esophagus and stomach doesn't fully relax. Coroner and you carried out a routine myotomy, will you just explain what the operation was? Professor Gorey: very briefly, the approach is to incise the esophageal muscle from the inferior pulmonary ligament to its entry into the stomach. Coroner: yes. Professor Gorey: because that is essentially the lower third of the esophagus where the thickened non-relaxing muscle resides. You make an incision down the muscle to relax it until the mucosa pouts into the incision literally. I carried out a routine myotomy. His recovery was complicated by a more prolonged than usual pneumothorax post his thoracotomy. Comment: a thoracotomy is an incision into the pleural space of the chest. It is performed by surgeons to gain access to the thoracic organs, most commonly the heart, the lungs, or the esophagus. Thoracotomy is a major surgical maneuver and as such requires general anesthesia with endotracheal tube insertion and mechanical ventilation. Thoracotomies are thought to be one of the most difficult surgical incisions to deal with post-operatively, because they are extremely painful and the pain can prevent the patient from breathing effectively, leading to atelectasis or pneumonia. Mirek's family state that Professor Michael Farrell's post-mortem report shows no evidence that the Heller's myotomy was performed on Mirek's esophagus, and supports the family's theory that an adverse incident or incidents occurred during the 6 hours Mirek was in the operating theater. The surgical team failed to advise the family of, and failed to document in the medical records the reason why Mirek was in the operating theater for a prolonged period of time, or why the Heller's myotomy was not carried out on Mirek's esophagus. The family should not have found out this for themselves from the post-mortem report. It would appear that the surgical team had to abandon Mirek's surgery because of an adverse incident during the surgery, and that is why the post-mortem shows no evidence of the Heller's myotomy on Mirek's esophagus. The family say, it was because of the contradictions between the original autopsy report, and Professor Michael Farrell's deposition, that coroner Dr. Brian Farrell didn't allow the original autopsy report from his witness Professor Michael Farrell to be read into the inquest as evidence. Autopsy report. January 1, 2000. Abdomen and contents. The esophagus in its lower two-thirds was markedly dilated with thinning of the wall. In his deposition, pathologist Professor Michael Farrell stated the following: the esophagus was markedly dilated in its lower two-thirds. Neuropathologist Professor Michael Farrell's autopsy report, and his inquest deposition, do not indicate that a Heller's myotomy, or any other surgical procedure having been performed on Mirek's esophagus. The Bingham family have further concerns that on 2 occasions in sworn evidence to the coroner's inquest, Professor Tom Gorey, consultant surgeon, claimed that he performed Mirek's surgery. But on being questioned for a 3rd time, Professor Tom Gorey confirmed that his junior colleague, surgical registrar, Dr. Deirdre O'Hanlon performed the surgery, which he supervised. However, as is well known within the medical community, supervising does not necessarily mean that the supervisor was physically present during the surgery. Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell failed to examine why Mirek's esophagus showed no evidence of a Heller's myotomy. After all the pain and suffering Mirek endured from his surgery on the October 4, 1999, until his death on December 31, 1999 at the Mater Hospital Dublin, the Bingham family find it incredulous that the post-mortem report shows no evidence of a Heller's myotomy. This series of videos has been released today, December 31, 2017, on the 18th anniversary of Mirek's untimely death, as the Bingham family have been prevented by the state and its agents, in particular the Coroner's Court and the High Court, from having an independent and thorough investigation into the events surrounding Mirek's death, and the actual cause of Mirek's death. The Bingham family have been left with no option, but to publicly release the documents and evidence that was available to those investigating Mirek's death, and present this evidence to the public, in the hope that the state and its agents will do their public duty and hold an independent inquiry into Mirek's death.